Thanks. Yeah, as Brendan said, I'm James. I'm from the Flemington Kensington branch. We meet not far from here. I am the token local for the panel. I'm a corporate lawyer by trade, and I was also on Moonee Valley City Council for a term out sort of that way. I was your typical, and again, I'm partly proof that not all Labor elected officials are union hacks or staffers. I have spent my entire career in the private sector. It's been an interesting one, and I'll talk a little bit about that and how that's informed my idea for the panel today. Daniel said to me, Jimmy, you work in the private sector, you've got a couple of other interests in networking and progressive professionals and that sort of stuff. I need you to come to me with an idea about how Labor can engage with business better and facilitate business. So I thought, okay, well, thought long and hard about what I'd seen on council, what I'd seen working in private practice, where I was an M&A lawyer by trade, basically spending a lot of time watching investment bankers thump tables and send angry emails. But also my time on council led me to a bit of a career change in my own outside of council life, where I went to work for a business called Australian Unity. Some of you may remember, it's got a funny history in that it was the merger of two old friendly societies. And when I talk friendly societies, we sort of went to the world of the Freemasons and the Stonecutters and secret handshakes and that sort of stuff. But essentially, its two main predecessors were the Manchester Unity Friendly Society and the Australian Natives Association. Friendly societies are a really interesting, sort of lesser known part of the business world. But essentially, what I saw from my time on council was that a core role that government plays, especially the whole council plays, is to deliver services and manage assets. At the end of the day, as an Australian grows up, he or she is going to be touched and have his or her life really dramatically affected by private sector entities, whether it's a childcare provider, kindergarten, whatever school you have, whoever you bank with, the aged care provider your family might have contact with. At the end of the day, the majority of your interactions are going to be with private sector entities. And this led me to the mutual sector for the simple fact that the mutual sector defines itself by the fact that it's member-owned. You'll all know and have seen the industry super fund campaign and the branding around that, where the idea is you have a business that is ruthlessly for profit, but the equity in the business is held by the actual customers as members rather than shareholders. One of the things I've learned from, and the one idea from working with either in the corporate head office of a business, helping it sort of run by advising the directors, and also advising its execs on how to keep the ship running, and at the same time helping them acquire, and a lot of them sort of consolidate and merge with a lot of smaller mutuals. And from my time working in private sector was, there needs to be a real push. If Labor really wants to improve average working people's lives and re-engage with business and do some real good for the business community, is to change the paradigm around regulation from one of strict compliance and one of regulation in the sense of control to regulation in terms of facilitation and engagement. And I'll talk about a couple of examples of what they actually mean by that. One of the things that's fascinated me working with corporates is that we still have in Australia a very much rail gauge approach to business regulation. What I mean by that is there is still a lot of regulation of businesses that occurs at the state level. Cameron talked about payroll tax, as well as that stamp duty plays an interesting role in businesses. Again, when you think of stamp duty, we're not talking about the stamp duty that you pay on individual home sales in your personal capacity. We're talking about the stamp duty that will differ from state to state when you buy and sell a business, depending on which state the entity is registered. So again, you could have a business in Queensland with shares that was incorporated in New South Wales or Victoria, and it may have stamp duty depending on whether or not with the state of incorporation. And again, depending if it has a sufficient amount of land and it becomes land rich. This can be a nightmare for when you're buying and selling businesses. And at the same time, what it actually does is the amount of tax you end up paying really is insignificant or not really relative to the compliance costs of having to actually go to the trouble of assessing how much tax you have to pay and then paying it. Again, there's a policy intent around stamp duty and around payroll tax. The question is, why do we in 2015 still have to have potentially 8 different jurisdictions in which you pay tax rather than just one? I mean, they talked about this a lot when the GST came out. It did, one of the selling points was that it removed a couple of old archaic state level taxes like FID and replaced it with a single tax, and then it was distributed to fund the state, to fund the state services. The critical point was it could have gone a whole lot further, and it needs to go a whole lot further. Another fascinating example of rail gauge business regulation that I love is trade promotions. When I'm talking about trade promotions, I'm talking about basic stuff like paddle pop liquor prize. You might see, chocolate bars that have offers on the inside. So, basically, if you want to run one of these trade promotions, any business in Australia, and you want to run it outside your one state, you've got to get a trade promotion permit from the state-based Trade Promotion Regulatory Authority. We're talking a permit that costs about $200. So if you want to run a national promotion, you're potentially dealing with 6 to 8 different trade promotion regulatory officers. You're then dealing with different thresholds, whether or not you need a permit, and different permit costs, depending on whether or not promotion meets the $5,000 or $10,000 threshold. Then there's different requirements, and you've got your individual forms you've got to fill out. To the point where I had a business pitch to the legal team at Australian Unity a piece of software that does the work for you, in that you input the terms of the promotion, so the terms and conditions, and it generates the forms for you. Then you email the forms to the authorities, then you get your permits at $740 a promotion. So we sort of went, well, I'm not sure if we do enough of those to justify the spend. But again, there's a rationale and a policy basis behind regulating trade promotions. When we talk about trade promotions, we're talking about old-fashioned, trade lotteries and that sort of stuff. Of course you want to regulate them. Of course you want to have a permit number that's attached to them. And of course you need transparency. But why in 2015 do you potentially need to have 5 different permit numbers and 5 different permits? And again, if you change the paradigm around regulation and policy making to one of facilitation, where it's less about control at the individual state level and more about how do we facilitate this in a way so businesses can continue to run trade promotions. A lot of them, especially if you look at FMCG and those sort of low margin products, trade promotions are critical to running those sorts of businesses and maintaining sales. How do we help business run those trade promotions in a way that still achieves the same policy goals, but in a way that doesn't require them to literally have, and this is what, there's a little cottage industry of these in law firms, and trade promotion paralegals, whose job it is to literally punch up the 4 or 5 different, or whatever it is, forms. Also, we're talking scanning the different levels of regulation. Okay, well, Victoria requires you to, have this term on the wrapper, but this one can be in the terms, and etc. Interestingly enough, the Andrews government recently just removed the requirement to have a trade promotion permit in Victoria, which I've never seen a couple of marketers so happy in my entire life. I've never ever seen a bunch of marketers that happy until I told them they didn't have to do trade promotion permits for their trade promotions in Victoria anymore. Another bit of old, legacy rail gauge regulation is not so much around business, but it's more applicable to the fundraising space. If you want to run a national charity drive, you literally have to go to 6 to 8 different fundraising authorities and potentially get permits. You then also have to report to those authorities how much you've raised each year. Potentially we're talking some permits run year to year, some states run permits over 3 years. At a seminar on the ACNC, I was told that Amnesty International in Australia spend $1 million a year just getting these forms filled out. Again, totally understand the policy basis behind reporting and registering fundraising drives and fundraising entities and the transparency. But again, do we have to have that, or still operate at the state level? Interestingly enough, one of Labor's greatest achievements from the last federal government was the Australian Charities Not-for-Profits Commission. And there was talk of it in the long term taking on that role as a national fundraising manager. Of course, if you're following the politics of the ACNC, it's a very different story now. But again, you've got to commend the Labor government for doing that. Again, one of the cracker examples, and it was an interesting campaign that was run that's really dropped off recently, is around director and officer liability. So around the time of when you had a couple of high-profile federal and even high court cases, around 2009, 2010, even the former chairman or the former commissioner of ASIC, Tony Delosio, came out and backed a campaign by the Australian Institute of Company Directors, where it was pointed out that there are, potentially, if you run a national business, over 700 different individual offences that a director or an officer of a company can be liable for personally. So if you're, in the case of corporate fault, depending on what sort of business you're running, if the company breaches the law, there's flow-on effects for the director or an officer. What this campaign in 2009-2010 found was that a lot of these laws, a significant number of them, didn't have due diligence defences, didn't have requirements for fault to be proved, and there was a real debate happening around that time, 2009-2010, as to whether or not it was appropriate. And also, there are flow-on costs in that it increases the cost of director and officer liability insurance, and it also increases the compliance costs of the business, because you then directors then require all their execs and the staff below them to do extra due diligence in monitoring whether or not you've infringed those laws, and also to keep up with changes. Again, one of the fascinating points I've heard recently is that within the fin services sector, one of the growing, and also other social services and health, one of the growing are compliance personnel. And I tell law graduates this: don't become a lawyer, become a compliance manager. We need more and more of these, and there are going to be more and more, you'll see that more and more law graduates become compliance managers than lawyers moving forward, simply because of this type of either sort of unruly regulation, or at the same time Australian business having to comply with overseas regulation in the way they do business. Again, federal Labor did a lot of work around this. It got together the premiers and the chief ministers at COAG back around 2009-2010. The Rudd-Gillard government did a lot of work in reviewing federal offences and making sure they were all principle-based. They had due diligence offences, and they had and you had to prove corporate fault, and at the same time personal fault. The distinction was, of course, the vast majority of those director and officer offences are still at the state-based level, and they're in really, really often obscure state-based legislation. These aren't easy things to do. You know, getting a bunch of chief ministers and premiers around a table and getting them to focus on things like trade promotion regulation, it isn't going to be the first thing that they want to talk about, and often isn't going to be the first thing that the federal government wants to do. But these are very small, very simple things you could do to make businesses' life a lot easier. Another, I guess the last point I want to discuss around changing that paradigm around facilitation or around regulation to one of facilitation is in the mutual sector and is in the provision of social services. And again, this was something that I watched while I was on council, and I've watched when I've been working with the mutual right now. Around when I got to council in late 2008, Australia's largest provider of childcare services, ABC Learning, which is publicly listed, fell apart. It was largely due to mismanagement rather than necessarily being a listed entity, but even before it fell apart due to basically mismanagement, as I said, there was a lot of discussion around whether or not it was appropriate for a listed entity to run a childcare business. There was a lot of discontent around the community, even in my local community, about the ABC-run centres versus community-run centres. And again, you're seeing it now. Affinity Education's now quite 10% of the market. It's aggressively expanding into further childcare centres, and there's a discussion. There's also criticisms from ethical investors as to whether or not this is appropriate. And again, this is one of the fascinating things you've really got to wrap your head around. The private sector and the mutual sector fills the gaps that the government doesn't fill. There are products the government may never ever provide, that the private sector will always provide, and what a government has to do is really think about whether or not it's regulating those appropriately. One classic example was that prior to the age pension and prior to Medicare, the Friendly Society sector provided unemployment benefits. They provided health insurance because you didn't have a government providing them to start with. The question then becomes, well, what else are they doing right now then? Those are all out of date. The one cracker sector to watch in terms of the roles of mutuals and also for growth is aged care. Aged care is a sector that is incredibly low margin, runs on federal subsidies, but at the same time, much like Cameron's example of taking the chocolates at $2.50 and adding on 50 cents, that's basically what happens. You know, the aged care sector gets a base federal subsidy for each individual person's living in a residence, and then adds on a margin on top. The question then we need to ask as a nation is one, are we regulating them in a way that the experience for the resident and also the family of that resident is a positive one? What sort of businesses do we want running these entities? Do we want listed companies that are going to have a whole lot more pressure to maintain lower margins and pay dividends? Do you want them to be run by member-owned or community-owned businesses? Do you want them to be run by a different type? And also, anybody who's ever currently had to go through the experience of moving a family member to an aged care facility will tell you the paperwork involved is horrendous. It also raises a lot of very serious questions around the role of the age pension, our reliance on, well, the nation's reliance and focus on home ownership as the main investment, vehicle, and also the base of most people's wealth. And again, the question really is, how do we facilitate these businesses rather than control and regulate them? The one fascinating area to watch around mutuals is also in the UK, where the UK Labour Party actually has a policy around public sector mutuals. The idea that if we're going to allow the private sector to run core services, would we rather than be run by an organisation that doesn't have shareholders per se, but returns benefits back to members? The classic example being, we have a situation in Victoria where our public transport network is run by a business owned by Hong Kong, or owned by Hong Kong investors. What sort of situation could you have, or what sort of world could we live in, when instead every MyKey user were entitled to go to Connex's AGM each year, and that they couldn't return profits back to shareholders. They had to reinvest whatever profits they made from running the business back into the business. Again, think about if you are a customer of a service run by the private sector, don't just think about it as a pure customer service provider relationship, but as the broader service that it is, and whether or not the service you're being provided is appropriate, and could it be in fact better. So again, I'll end it on at that point. I'm sorry I'm not being able to provide the great sweeping, nation-building, sort of level of ideas that you will from other speakers. But at the end of the day, one thing I would say, I guess, Edward, is again, you want to facilitate business, you want to help create jobs, you want to help create increased tax revenue. Have a very careful think about how we regulate those businesses that do all that job and tax creation.